The square outside the Parliament building was dressed in precision. Flags snapped against a brisk wind, their colors arranged like a painting too carefully chosen to be coincidence. Soldiers in polished boots stood at rigid attention, lining the carpet that had been rolled out in the exact center of the plaza. Crowds pressed against the barriers, murmuring in anticipation, some hopeful, some skeptical, but all aware that they were about to witness one of those moments that history books later describe with their italics. Cameras perched like birds along scaffolds, lenses trained toward the stage where the Prime Minister was expected to deliver a speech marking the anniversary of the nation's founding. The Prime Minister arrived to applause measured, respectful, the applause of a people reminded of ceremony more than swept by passion. He mounted the podium with the practiced grace of a man used to stages. His aides flanked him discreetly, earpieces glinting, their eyes scanning for threats in the sea of faces. A military band rested its instruments at its side, waiting for the cue that would turn silence into anthem. The air itself seemed to wait, and then it happened. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. At first he looked like any other man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain dark coat. But there was something unmistakable in the way he moved. Steady, deliberate, with the kind of discipline that refuses to be hurried by either applause or alarm. The crowd noticed first, their whispers rising in a ripple. Then the cameras pivoted, catching the figure as he crossed the open space between spectators and ceremony. Gasps followed as recognition spread. He was one of the tomb guards. Everyone had seen their images before. Men of unyielding stillness, faces carved into silence. Guardians of the resting place of the unknown soldiers. They were figures of ritual, never breaking formation, never acting outside the carefully choreographed movements of duty. Yet here he was, stepping into the heart of a political ceremony, his expression unreadable, his stride unstoppable. Security stiffened immediately. Several plainclothes officers moved toward him, hands raised to intercept. The crowd tensed, certain they were about to see him dragged away. The Prime Minister himself paused mid-sentence, his words faltering, his eyes narrowing as he realized the ceremony had been breached. But the guard did not falter. He raised no hand, carried no weapon. He simply walked, each step echoing louder than the Prime Minister's amplified words. His eyes did not shift left or right. They fixed on the podium, on the flag draped beside it, on something beyond the visible frame of politics. "Stop him," one aide hissed, and two security men reached out. But the guard did something strange then. He saluted, not to the Prime Minister, not to the crowd, but to the flag standing at the edge of the stage. The motion was so crisp, so filled with authority, that the men froze mid-grab. For an instant, they too seemed caught by the gravity of his silence. The crowd did not breathe. The cameras leaned closer. The Prime Minister, visibly unsettled, stepped back from the podium as the guard mounted the first stair. Aides gestured frantically. The band looked at one another, horns half raised, unsure if they should play or pray. The guard stopped at the top of the stairs, just short of the podium. He stood still, shoulders squared, chin lifted. For a moment he looked as if he were about to resume the eternal watch he usually kept at the tomb. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached inside his coat. The crowd gasped audibly. Security tensed, preparing for the worst. But what he drew out was no weapon. It was a small, folded envelope, worn at the edges, its paper softened by many hands. He held it high, so that the cameras caught it, so that the crowd saw it. It was nothing more than a letter. His silence was more eloquent than any shout could have been. The Prime Minister's face tightened, confusion warring with curiosity. The guard took one more step and extended the envelope. For a moment, the two men faced one another. The leader of a nation and the sentinel of its memory. One with power to command armies, the other with power to command silence. The envelope bridged them like a fragile but unbreakable thread. The Prime Minister hesitated. His aides shook their heads furiously. One mouthed the word, "No." But the weight of the guard's presence was undeniable. Slowly, almost against his own instincts, the Prime Minister reached out and took the envelope. Their hands touched for a fraction of a second. Civilian authority meeting sacred duty. The guard stepped back immediately, his role complete. He did not turn to the cameras, did not raise his arms for drama. He resumed his rigid posture, eyes forward, as though the stage had become another tomb to guard. The Prime Minister looked down at the envelope in his hand, then out at the crowd, which was utterly still. His speech, his carefully rehearsed rhetoric, suddenly seemed irrelevant. He fumbled with the paper, then held it close, unsure whether to read it or hide it. The camera zoomed in, capturing his indecision, the rare sight of power caught unprepared. The audience felt the moment teetering on a knife's edge. Was this an act of defiance? A protest? A breach of decorum? No one knew yet. All they knew was that a tomb guard had broken centuries of silence to hand something to the nation's leader. And that mattered. The Prime Minister's lips parted, but the words would not come. The guard did not move. The rain of whispers in the crowd grew louder, but no one dared shout. Everyone waited. And the ceremony that had begun as a routine celebration now hung suspended, transformed into something raw, fragile, and charged with meaning no one yet understood. The square was so silent that even the flutter of flags seemed like thunder. The Prime Minister stood holding the envelope, its weight out of proportion with its size. Around him, aides shifted uncomfortably, urging him with frantic eyes to continue the prepared script, to steer the moment back into safe waters. But his hands trembled. The cameras caught it, magnifying his hesitation for millions of eyes watching across the nation. He opened the flap. The paper inside was fragile, folded and refolded so many times that the creases looked like scars. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The handwriting was uneven, faded, but still legible. He began to read silently, then aloud, his voice breaking the tension like a chisel tapping stone. My dearest, if these words are ever read by another's lips, it means I did not come home. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Prime Minister swallowed hard and forced himself to continue. I do not regret the path I walked. I regret only the moments I will not see, the smile of our child when she learns to ride a bicycle, the warmth of your hand in old age. I regret the dinners missed, the lullabies unsung. But know this, I carried you with me into every battle. When fear pressed close, I remembered your voice. If the nation asks what we gave, tell them we gave everything, and ask them in return to remember us not only with monuments, but with kindness to the living who wait for footsteps that will not return. The Prime Minister's voice cracked on the last line. When loneliness howled, I held fast to the memory of your laughter. He pressed the page against the podium, his chest rising and falling as though the words themselves had taken something out of him. The crowd was motionless, tears streaming freely down the faces of strangers who suddenly felt less like strangers. He lifted his eyes toward the tomb guard, who stood still as stone. Where did this come from? He asked, not into the microphone, but directly to the man who had delivered it. The guard's lips parted for the first time. His voice was low, steady, but carried with a resonance that needed no amplification. It was written by a soldier before his final deployment. It never reached his family. It was left behind, tucked into an old trunk, forgotten. I found it when his belongings were given to the tomb. I swore I would carry it until someone had the courage to speak it aloud. The Prime Minister blinked rapidly, his composure cracking further. And why now? Because today, the guard said, you speak of unity and sacrifice, but speeches are only air. These words are blood. They remind us that sacrifice is not abstract. It is a father missing from a kitchen table, a husband absent from a shared bed, a child waiting for footsteps that will never climb the stairs. If the nation is to be worthy, it must hear him, even now. A murmur ran through the audience, not outrage, not disapproval, but the low sound of agreement that comes from deep inside human chests. The Prime Minister looked down again at the letter, then out at the sea of faces. Something shifted in his expression. The polish of politics melted away. In its place was a man confronted with truth too heavy to ignore. He set aside his prepared notes. He held up the letter with both hands, as if offering it to the world. This, he said, voice thick with emotion, is the speech we needed today. And then He read the entire letter aloud, beginning to end without interruption. Every line, every tremor of ink, every ache that the soldier had poured onto paper decades earlier. The words carried across the square, through the cameras, into living rooms and kitchens and quiet bedrooms across the country. People listening at home wept as if they too had known the soldier, as if the letter had been addressed to them personally. By the time the Prime Minister finished, he could not speak further. He folded the letter carefully, placed it against his chest, and bowed his head. The crowd erupted not in applause, but in sobs, in silence, in the sound of a nation remembering. Veterans saluted, their hands shaking. Mothers held children tighter. Families of the fallen clutched photographs and whispered names. The tomb guard remained motionless, his duty fulfilled. He had interrupted power not to shame it, but to remind it. He had broken silence not for himself, but for one voice that should never have been lost. Later that evening, news broadcasts played the moment endlessly. Analysts debated protocol, questioned security, speculated about political consequences, but none of that mattered to the people. What mattered were the words on that page. In towns and villages, families lit candles and placed them in windows. In schools, teachers read excerpts aloud to students, who sat in rapt silence. Social media filled with a single refrain, "We remember." The Prime Minister himself ordered the letter to be placed in the National Archives, beside the founding documents, declaring that the voice of a fallen soldier deserved equal permanence. He reminded us, the Prime Minister said, that our nation is not built on speeches but on lives given, lives remembered. But the guard returned to his post at the tomb, resuming his watch as if nothing had changed. He spoke again days later, acknowledging that the guard's interruption had moved him more than any advisor's counsel. Visitors who saw him afterward noticed something different, though. His stillness seemed deeper, his silence more eloquent. They felt, standing before him, that they too were part of the vigil. The story of that day became legend. The guard who interrupted the Prime Minister, not with anger but with remembrance, not with protest but with love. And the nation carried the lesson forward that respect is not measured in ceremonies alone, but in the courage to let forgotten voices speak again.